You can start. Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to start.
I'm ready.
Perfect. The stage is yours.
Well, good evening. I'm Coufoudakis. I'm Professor Emeritus of Political Science in the Indiana University system. I would like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Klearchos, Kyriakides, Dinos Toumazos, and Eva Ieridou, who took the initiative to organize this webinar in honor of Professor Speros Vryonis. Those of us who had the privilege to know him and to work with him admired his intellect, his contributions to the field of history, and of course to the study of Greece. I will not go through his many publications. I will only point to two of his major contributions, one being, of course, the much acclaimed classic study that was published 50 years ago by the University of California Press under the title The Decline of Medieval Hellenism in Asia Minor, and the other book, of course, being The Mechanism of Catastrophe on the pogrom carried out against the Greek minority of Istanbul in the nights of September 6 and 7, 1955. It is of particular relevance today that we commemorate those events because this is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. This is also the month commemorating the Armenian Genocide. The mechanism of catastrophe is based on original research conducted by Professor Vryonis in Turkish archives. The passing of Professor Vryonis in 2019 marks the loss of a distinguished historian. Born and raised in the United States, Professor Vryonis was proud of his Hellenic heritage. He was known for his brilliant mind and for his command of multiple foreign languages, which allowed him to conduct original research in various countries. Those of us who had the privilege to know him and to work with him respect his academic work. We respect him as a colleague and as a friend. He never allowed difficulties in his own life to undermine the integrity or the quality of his work. Today's discussion is of particular relevance as Turkey's genocidal actions continue not only against its own minorities, but also in areas recently occupied by the Turkish army, both in northern Syria and, of course, since 1974 in occupied Cyprus. This being Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month provides a major opportunity for all of us to state in unequivocal terms, never again. Now, before I turn over the program to my colleague, Dr. Kyriakides, I would also like to remind the audience of an event scheduled for Thursday, April the 22nd at 5:30 Cyprus time, involving a discussion with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cyprus on the upcoming talks on Cyprus in Geneva. Dr. Kyriakides.
Thank you, Professor Coufoudakis. It gives me a great pleasure to follow you in this online event. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers, Agora Dialogue, for kindly inviting me to deliver this lecture to all intents and purposes in honor of the late Professor Speros Vryonis Jr., who was born in 1928 and died in 2019. I didn't have the privilege of meeting him, but I consider him to be an informal de facto mentor, because he instructed me and taught me from afar through the books that he wrote, the articles that he wrote, and the lectures that he delivered. So I'm very much honoured to be speaking in his memory today. Whatever I say today, I should stress, reflects my own personal views and not those of any organisation with which I am or have been associated. I am, as it happens, an assistant professor in the School of Law at the Cyprus campus of the University of Central Lancashire, and my academic background is a mixture of history and law, and this lecture today will reflect that interdisciplinary background. As Professor Coufoudakis has indicated, April is a month indelibly associated with genocide. Every year, the 7th day of April is designated as the International Day of Reflection on the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. It's an international day organised by the United Nations. The 11th day of April is earmarked as the International Day of the Liberation of the Nazi concentration camps. Meanwhile, the 24th day of April is Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. For these and for other reasons, April has come to be known as Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. And as the name suggests, the primary objectives of this month are to promote awareness as to what is meant by genocide, and also to highlight why it's so important to prevent any recurrence of genocide today or in the future. What then is genocide? Well, in brief, it is a concept coined by the late Raphael Lemkin, who was born in 1900 and died in 1949. He was the pioneering academic, lawyer, and author of the classic book published in 1944 and entitled Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, Laws of Occupation and Analysis of Government Proposals for Redress. And one of those proposals for redress was to recognize the existence of genocide as a crime under international law. Thanks in part to the efforts of Lemkin, genocide eventually came to be recognized as an international crime, expressly prohibited as well as expressly defined. And that took place under the Genocide Convention, or to give it its full name, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that was adopted in 1948, at around about the same time as the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the aftermath of the adoption of the United Nations Charter in 1945, and shortly before the adoption conventions of 1949. The late 1940s and the aftermath of the Second World War were associated with the construction of what has come to be known as the post-1945 legal order. Now, under Article 2 of the Crime of Genocide Convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And semicolon followed by the list. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transfer a group to another group. So under the wording of the convention, it's not necessary for all of those elements to be satisfied. But what does need to be satisfied for the crime of genocide to arise is for one of those acts that I've listed to be committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The Crime of Genocide Convention may have been adopted in 1948, but the preamble, that is to say, the introductory wording to the convention, expressly recognizes that, and I quote, "At all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity." So there's a recognition there that genocide may have arisen in the form of a convention in 1948, but genocide has been inflicted with great losses to humanity throughout all periods of history. Both before and after 1948, genocide appears to have been indeed inflicted in the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as in surrounding areas, such as Southeast Europe and the Middle East. Now, I use the phrase appears because we have regrettably few court cases or judgments of courts which affirm that genocide has indeed taken place in those areas that I've just mentioned. But in those areas, the victims of genocide include, or appear to include, the Greek Orthodox Christian, Armenian Orthodox Christian, and Syriac Orthodox Christian victims of Ottoman Turkey, plus the Jewish victims of the Nazi occupation of Greece, as well as nearby Yugoslavia and other parts of Southeast Europe. Furthermore, as confirmed by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in cases such as Prosecutor and Radovan Karadzic, Muslims became victims of genocide as at Srebrenica in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That, of course, was at the time of the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia and the troubles that arose during the 1990s. Today, I'm going to focus on the Greek Orthodox Christian victims of genocide and of other international crimes, such as crimes against humanity and war crimes. That being said, on the occasion of Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month, I express solidarity with the families of all victims of genocide, whatever their religious or other backgrounds. I also pay tribute to the late Professor Speros Vryonis Jr., an American historian of Hellenic heritage, whose legacy is not only colossal, but multidimensional as well. By means of well-researched, extensively documented, and sophisticated books and other contributions to the public dialogue, the multilingual Vryonis shed light on various issues. Chief among these is a question that boils down to this: why did the ethnic Greeks and Greek Orthodox Christians of the ancient city once known as Byzantium initially lose control of the city in 1453 before declining in number and then, subject to a few exceptions, vanishing from the city altogether? Byzantium, of course, was renamed as Constantinople in 330 and as Istanbul in 1930. Now, among the publications of Vryonis is a monumental trilogy that collectively addresses the question that I've effectively articulated. In chronological order, this trilogy consists of the following books: Byzantium and Europe, which was published by Brace and World in 1967, The Decline of Medieval Hellenism in Asia Minor and the Process of Islamization from the 11th through the 15th century, published by the Caliph in 1971, and The Mechanism of Catastrophe, the Turkish pogrom of September the 6th to the 7th, 1955, and the destruction of the Greek community of Istanbul. That was published by GreekWorks.com in 2005. Now, as I've already indicated, the linchpin of this trilogy is that ancient city of Byzantium. So let me just say a few words about each of the three books that I've just mentioned. Towards the end of the first of these three books, Byzantium and Europe, Vryonis graphically accounts for the downfall of Constantinople, as it was then known, in 1453. In so doing, he effectively identifies the beginning of the end of Hellenism in that cosmopolitan city. At the time, Vryonis identifies the essential characteristics of what he later depicted as the mechanism of catastrophe. For my part, I would define this mechanism as encompassing the arbitrary, discriminatory, and otherwise inhumane assault on people, their properties, and their religious sites. And I've deliberately focused on people, their properties, and their religious sites because it reflects the preoccupation of Vryonis in his book. With reference to the Greek Orthodox Christians, he focuses on their plight, the plight of their properties, and the plight of their religious sites, such as their churches and their cemeteries. At the same time, of course, Vryonis quite rightly drew attention to the suffering endured by others, such as the Armenians and the Jews who inhabited the Ottoman Empire. I mean, his analysis of the fall of Constantinople in 1453, as set out in the first book in the trilogy, Byzantium in Europe, Vryonis lays bare the nature and the scale of the inhumanity that ran riot in that year upon the downfall of the ancient city. And I quote an emblematic example from his book. Men, women, and children were massacred without discrimination or pity. After the first orgy of slaughter, the victorious Muslims systematically plundered churches, monasteries, palaces, and houses. Great numbers of prisoners were taken and enslaved, and the booty which the Ottoman soldiery gathered was such as they had never seen before. After 3 days of horrible pillaging, Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II entered the Greek Orthodox Christian cathedral of Hagia Sophia, mounted the pulpit, accompanied by an imam, and the Friday prayer was recited. The Sultan then entered the Christian sanctuary, where he personally destroyed the altar, an act which symbolized the end of 1,000 years of history. That's a very poignant thought. But of course, when Kemal came to power in Turkey, he converted Hagia Sophia from a mosque into a museum. Of course, it had previously been a Greek Orthodox cathedral and the centerpiece of Greek Orthodox Christianity in Constantinople. And for many, many years, the Hagia Sophia remained a museum. And in the year 2020, the authoritarian regime of President Erdogan in Turkey reconverted Hagia Sophia Cathedral from a museum, as it had been for the past few decades, back into a mosque. Let me now turn to the second element of the trilogy of Vryonis, the decline of medieval Hellenism in Asia Minor and the process of Islamization from the 11th through the 15th century. Vryonis looks beyond Byzantium. In this book, published 50 years ago by the University of California Press, Vryonis focuses on what he calls the process of Islamization, with its de-Hellenizing and de-Christianizing ramifications in Asia Minor, where Greeks had lived since antiquity. In this context, Vryonis alludes to the culture of conquest, which infused the mindset, decision, actions of the Ottoman Turkish conquerors of Asia Minor. And Asia Minor, to all intents and purposes, is the Anatolian Peninsula. It is the geographical part of the world where present-day Turkey is situated, to all intents and purposes, I repeat. To quote Vryonis, once property, churches, and people were lost to Islam, they could never be reclaimed, for according to Islamic law and historical tradition, once Muslim, always Muslim. Since the state was Muslim, this principle was always enforced. So that's an insight into the culture of conquest that Vryonis describes so extensively in his book. Vryonis goes on to clarify that the destructive character of the Turkish conquest and settlement, which contributed so greatly to the violent dislocation of Byzantine society, was largely, though not exclusively, due to the nomadic Turkmen tribes entering Anatolia as unruly conquerors inspired by jihad and their instinct for plunder, and settling upon the land in compact groups. They were long bane to the settled Christian populations. So again, here one sees the theme of Vryonis, the attack on people, their properties, and their religious sites. When the Ottoman Turkish Empire disintegrated during the late 19th century and the early 20th century, people, their properties, and their religious sites likewise fell victim to fresh waves of mass inhumanity that appeared to cross the threshold from what I call non-genocidal criminality into genocidal criminality. And on those occasions, we're talking here about the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. On those occasions, the upshot was the near complete obliteration of Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian Orthodox Christians, and Syriac Orthodox Christians from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Now, for Greeks, and I'm going to have to focus on Greeks in view of preoccupations of Vryonis in his book, although he did quite rightly discuss other attacks, including attacks on Armenians. But I'll just, in view of the time constraints, limit my remarks here to the attacks on the Greeks. For Greeks, the visual symbol of the mass inhumanity unleashed towards the end of the Ottoman Empire was the incineration, the destruction, and the ethnic cleansing of the city of Smyrna in September 1922. Yet, however visually horrifying and actually horrifying this incineration undoubtedly was, it must never overshadow the collective genocidal suffering endured by Christians during this fateful epoch. Among those who paid a particularly heavy price were the Greek Orthodox Christians in the Pontus region along the Black Sea, plus the Armenian and Assyrian Christians in their ancestral lands under Ottoman rule. But it's important to note that the attack on Greek Orthodox Christians was not limited to Asia Minor. There were attacks on Greeks in Thrace, Thrace, and in other parts of the world. In this context, I can do little better than refer to the relatively recent book of two historians, Benny Morris and Dror Zevi. The book is entitled The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's Destruction of its Christian Minorities, 1894 to 1924. The book published in 2019 by Harvard University Press. For the purposes of this lecture, it suffices if I quoted from the official synopsis of the book published by Harvard University Press. I do so because in a sense, it's in keeping with one of the themes of Vryonis, which is that we must view the various genocides in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Greater Middle East as part of an overarching mechanism of catastrophe. Right, this is what the official synopsis says. Between 1894 and 1924, 3 waves of violence swept across Anatolia, targeting the region's Christian minorities, who had previously accounted for 20% of the population. By 1924, the Armenians, Assyrians, and the Greeks had been reduced to 2%. Most historians have treated these waves as distinct, isolated events, and successive governments presented them as an unfortunate sequence of accidents. The 30-Year Genocide, the book that was published in 2019, is the first account to show that the 3 were actually part of a single, continuing, and intentional effort to wipe out Anatolia's Christian population. In the aftermath of the First World War and the subsequent Greek-Turkish War, fresh inhumanity was imposed to the detriment of Greek Orthodox Christians as well as Muslims. This time, inhumanity was imposed by the full force of law. I refer to the Convention concerning the exchange of Greek and Turkish populations, signed at Lausanne on the 30th of January 1923. Under Article 1 of this Lausanne Convention, there were a number of mentions, but under this one, which was dated 30th of January 1923, as from the 1st of May 1923, there shall take place a compulsory exchange of Turkish nationals of the Greek Orthodox religion established in Turkish territory and of Greek nationals of the Muslim religion established in Greek territory. These persons shall not return to live in Turkey or Greece, respectively, without the authorization of the Turkish government or of the Greek government, respectively. In other words, the Lausanne Convention of the 30th of January 1923 was for what today would be described as legalized ethnic cleansing, legalized discrimination on religious grounds, and thus legalized inequality. Yet at the time, it was seen to be the price to be paid for a peace, in inverted commas, I would suggest, between Greece and Turkey. Now, nothing along those lines ought to be negotiated or brought into force today, but the concept of a retrospective legalized recognition of, in inverted commas, exchanges of populations is something that the United Nations has been cooking up in respect of the Republic of Cyprus. One only needs to read Resolution 750 of the United Nations Security Council and the report to which it relates to understand the reasons for that. I'm not going to discuss that in any great detail, but the idea of legalizing ethnic cleansing and demographic engineering in a retrospective sense is something that regrettably blights the Republic of Cyprus, because it is indeed one of the unspoken objectives of the so-called peace process in the Republic of Cyprus. Now, let me go back to 1923. Among those who were spared compulsory deportation on the grounds of their religion were citizens of Greece and Turkey. Under Article 2 of the Lausanne Convention of the 30th of January 1923, the following persons shall not be included in the exchange provided for in Article 1. A, the Greek inhabitants of Constantinople, and B, the Muslim inhabitants of Western Thrace. And again, this is a further example of legalized discrimination and legalized preferential treatment to the detriment, to the purported benefit of some, but to the disbenefit of others. Now, in due course, those described by the Lausanne Convention as the Greek inhabitants of Constantinople fell victim to what amounted to a war of attrition that reached its peak in 1955. The statistics published by the Foreign Ministry of Greece speak for themselves. I'm reading here from the website, the official website of the Foreign Ministry of Greece. After the 1923 Lausanne Treaty and the mandatory population exchange provided for therein, more than 100,000 ethnic Greeks remained in Istanbul, as well as on Goxiada, island of Ross, and Boxkada, the island of Denidos. Today, less than 3,500 ethnic Greek residents remain in Turkey. That's an astonishing and an astronomical decline in the population, the Greek population of modern-day Turkey since 1923, 100 or so years ago. This Vryonis, because in the third book in this trilogy, Vryonis tried to account for that drastic reduction in the size of the Greek population of Turkey generally and of what was renamed by Turkey as Istanbul. Now, in the final phase of his career, Vryonis became preoccupied with researching and writing about the abhorrent crimes committed on 2 days in September 1955, the 6th and the 7th of September. Once again, the focus of his writing was the effect of inhumanity to the detriment of their properties and their religious sites, in this particular case, churches. The book that emerged from this research is entitled The Mechanism of Catastrophe, the Turkish Pogrom of September the 6th to 7th, 1955, and the Destruction of the Greek Community of Istanbul. Now, in this masterpiece, for that's what it is, it's a masterpiece, Vryonis traces the causes as well as the consequences of a vicious pogrom that targeted ethnic Greeks and Greek Orthodox Christians, but resulted in the targeting of Armenians and Jews as well. Vryonis produces voluminous archival and other evidence in support of what amounts to one basic thesis. I'll just try to encapsulate it in a sentence. The thesis is that the pogrom was pre-planned, state-orchestrated, and ruthlessly executed by the government of the then Prime Minister of Turkey, Adnan Menderes. Menderes held office as Prime Minister of Turkey from until 1960. Now, in the mechanism of catastrophe, Vryonis also reproduces a selection of harrowing photographs taken by Dimitrios Galoumenos, the official photographer of the ecumenical patriarchate at the time of the pogrom. Remember, one of the last vestiges of Hellenism in Byzantium, Constantinople, and as it's now known by Turkey, Istanbul, is the patriarchate. And the official photographer took an astonishing set of photographs that recorded the disaster in September 1955 as it unfolded, and it also recorded the consequences of the disaster. If a picture paints 1,000 words, each of those photographs illustrates one of the key themes of Vryonis, albeit in a different geographical region and in different circumstances. The pogrom of the 6th and 7th of September 1955 was a chilling echo of the pogrom known as Kristallnacht on the night of the 9th and 10th of November 1938. Now, during Kristallnacht, the Nazis in Germany, as well as Austria, planned, state-orchestrated and ruthlessly executed pogrom that targeted the Jews in the two countries that I mentioned, which at the time were synonymous with Adolf Hitler. During that pogrom, which foreshadowed the genocide known as the Holocaust, those in the firing line were Jews, their properties, and their synagogues. And in a sense, the same mechanism of catastrophe unfolded on Kristallnacht. In an article published on the 6th of September 2018, and primed by the Papas Post, Vryonis wrote about what he branded Kristallnacht in Constantinople. I mean, this article was just a synopsis of his book, and it helpfully encapsulates the core themes of his book. But I was caught rather by the title of the article, Kristallnacht in Constantinople. And in that article, Vryonis not only summarized the findings embedded in his book on the mechanism of catastrophe, but he also stressed the overall impact of the people, their properties, and their churches. So let me quote Vryonis. The lethal pogrom of the 6th to 7th of September 1955 delivered a fatal blow to the Greek community and Hellenism of Constantinople in 7 hours. Well planned for some years, masterfully carried out in a well-organized manner by the Turkish government, Turks destroyed 71 churches, 41 schools, 4,008 stores, the offices and debate newspapers, and approximately 2,100 dwellings, all of the property of the Greeks and their communities in Istanbul. The Turks killed 28 Greeks and also carried out the rapes of Greek women. They profaned and soiled the Greek Orthodox religious vessels. They smashed and dug up the graves in Greek cemeteries, throwing out the bones and remains of the dead. They effected circumcisions on some elderly priests on the streets. The Turkish government, press, and nation justified, in inverted commas, this savagery on the false pretext that the Greeks had bombed the house of Ataturk in Thessaloniki, where Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, had been born. In reality, the Greeks had not placed the bomb in the Turkish consulate complex in that city on the 6th of September 1955. It had been put there by a Turk in collusion with the Turkish government in order to provide the pretext for a carefully laid plan to destroy the houses, the businesses, the properties, the schools, and the newspapers of the Greeks in Constantinople. Vryonis concludes with the following thought, among others. I'll just quote one of them. All of this was a logical, in inverted commas, logical sequence in Turkish minds to the oppressive Balik Vergisi of 1942 to 43. That was a Turkish confiscatory law which destroyed the economic basis of the Greek and other minorities in Turkey. In parts of the mechanism of catastrophe, I'll now go back to the book, having read out the synopsis written by Vryonis. In parts of the mechanism of catastrophe, Vryonis steps back from the detail of what occurred on those two nights in September 1955 in Istanbul. He steps back from the detail to look at the bigger picture. In so doing, he indicates that the mechanism of catastrophe, as exhibited in September 1955, was, and to all intents and purposes remains, a long-standing feature of the Turkish state. It predates as well as postdates the formation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. In a similar vein, towards the end of the mechanism of catastrophe, Vryonis points to the existence of a web, as he calls it, and he explains what this web entails in the following terms. Although the pogrom of September 6th to 7th, 1955 occurred half a century ago, he's writing here in 2005, its legacy is caught up in a larger web of regional and international interests. This web is, indeed, the key to understanding important parts of this ongoing history. And in a sense, herein lies the enduring legacy of Vryonis as an academic. Vryonis effectively teaches us to consider the various victims of the mechanism of catastrophe wielded by Turkey, as if they are all caught up in the same sprawling web for which the Turkish state is ultimately responsible. So it doesn't really matter whether we're dealing with the Greek victims of the mechanism in Smyrna in 1922, or in Bondos in 1922, or Istanbul 5, or in Cyprus in 1974. What we're dealing with are victims of the same sprawling web that encompasses various different places and encompasses various different epochs or years. In other words, the victims of this mechanism of catastrophe did not suffer in isolation from one another. They suffered within the framework of the same web and by means of this same mechanism of catastrophe that targeted and continues to target people, their properties, and their religious sites. Put simply, Vryonis teaches us to join the dots. Vryonis also warns us that the mechanism of catastrophe is continually operating, for example, with its assault on by means of the distortion of history or the manipulation of facts, but that the mechanism of catastrophe may increase in tempo depending upon the circumstances or the preferences of the Turkish state. This is precisely what happened to the detriment of Christians during pivotal years such as 1453, 1571, when the island of Cyprus was conquered by Turkey, 1915, when the Ottoman genocide of the Armenians reached its peak, 1920, 1955, and of course in relation to the Republic of Cyprus, 1974. So let me close by just saying a few words about the Republic of Cyprus, and then venturing some closing remarks. In the summer of 1974, for reasons which are well known, there was a coup in Nicosia. Turkey exploited that pretext and invaded the Republic of Cyprus in two interlinked invasions, one which launched on the July 1974, and the second of which was launched 3 weeks after the downfall of the junta in Athens and the pro-junta regime in Nicosia on the 14th of August 1974. Turkey proceeded to occupy 36% of the territory of the Republic of Cyprus, as well as a whopping 57% of its coastline. Yet again, as Vryonis implies in the mechanism of catastrophe, that mechanism was energized with appalling for people, properties, and religious sites, particularly in what became the Turkish-occupied north of the Republic of Cyprus. And let me stress here, every citizen of the Republic of Cyprus, irrespective of ethnicity or religion, suffered in that fateful year and in the years that followed. But in the firing line of Turkey were Greek Orthodox Christians and other Christians who were citizens of the Republic of Cyprus. And total 78% or so of the population. Now, initially, thousands of people were killed or injured. Not all at the hands of Turkey, of course, but the overwhelming majority would appear were killed or seriously injured at the hands of Turkey. Hundreds of others disappeared or went missing. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of citizens of the Republic of Cyprus, of Greek Orthodox, Christian, Muslim, or other backgrounds, were forcibly displaced so that Turkey could achieve, albeit de facto, its segregationist, partitionist, and expansionist aims. Since 1974, Turkey has ethnically cleansed all but a few of the Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Maronite Christian inhabitants of the Turkish-occupied north of the Republic of Cyprus. So much so that the de facto subordinate administration of Turkey in the Turkish-occupied north has boasted that the religion there, and I quote, is Islam, with Muslims making up 99% of the de facto population. I've added the phrase de facto. Parallel, Turkey has overseen the wholesale de facto confiscation of the properties of the forcibly displaced victims. So we see the mechanism of catastrophe in action, an attack on people, an attack on their properties. And what we also see with the Turkish occupied north of the Republic of Cyprus is an attack on churches and on cultural heritage generally. The pitiful fate of the church in the Turkish has been summarized in the following way by an official publication of the government of the Republic of Cyprus entitled "The Loss of a Civilization, Destruction of Cultural Heritage in Occupied Cyprus." I quote, "More than 500 churches and monasteries have been looted or destroyed in the Turkish occupied north of the Republic of Cyprus. More than 15,000 icons of saints, innumerable sacred liturgical vessels, gospels, and other objects of great value. Literally, a few churches have met a different fate and have been turned into mosques, museums, places of entertainment, or even hotels, such as the Church of Hagia Anastasia in Labithos. Many Byzantine churches have suffered irreparable damage, and many cemeteries have been desecrated or destroyed. I should declare an interest here, the cemeteries where relatives of mine in Turkish-occupied Bedra and Turkish-occupied Lisi have, to all intents and purposes, been destroyed or ransacked. In closing, I venture two thoughts by way of conclusion. Firstly, the Eastern Mediterranean has become indelibly associated with conquests, invasions, occupations, and the grotesque consequences of mass acts of inhumanity, such as those arising from the commission of the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. In alphabetical order, the victims include Christians, Jews, and Muslims. In a sense, the victims also include their properties and their religious sites. All that being said, Christians have paid a particularly heavy price at the hands of Turkey, in both its Ottoman and Republican manifestations. Indeed, Christians continue to pay a heavy price at the hands of Turkey today. This reality is borne out by various sources. I will refer to just two here. The first is the Bishop of Truro's independent review for the UK Foreign Secretary in a report on how the UK can support persecuted Christians worldwide. That report, or that independent review, was published in 2019 and is freely available online on the website of the review, christianpersecutionreview.org.uk. The second report, which is also available online on the website of the US State Department, is the Turkey 2020 Human Rights Report. Both of those documents show that the mechanism of catastrophe is, to all intents and purposes, still being wielded today to the detriment of people, their properties, and their religious sites, including, in the case of Christians, their churches. The second point I want to make by way of conclusion is this. It's gratifying that a measure of international criminal justice has been delivered by the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, by the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, and by a hand such tribunals. Be that as it may, for reasons best known to itself, the United Nations has never established an international criminal tribunal for either Turkey or for the Republic of Cyprus. Partly as a result of this failure, the Eastern Mediterranean has been and continues to be afflicted by a deep-seated culture of impunity. With that in mind, I leave the last word to Vryonis. In the preface to the Mechanism of Catastrophe, published at the dawn of the Erdogan epoch in Turkey that had begun in 2003 and is still continuing today in 2021, Vryonis wrote the following words. These words were blunt, they were wise, and they were prophetic. This is what Vryonis wrote in the Mechanism of Catastrophe. What had, early on in my academic career, astonished me was the readiness not only of the US government and State Department, but also to prostitute the truth for money, recognition, and or political acceptance. Despite the argument that one can never know the real truth, in inverted commas, such moral relativism opens the door to arbitrariness, dictatorship, and the violation of any and all forms of justice. With that, I thank you for listening.
I would like to thank Professor Kyriakides for a brilliant exposition on the issue of genocide, and particularly how genocide has been implemented in Greek-Turkish relations in Cyprus, the whole area of the Middle East. I want to also remind you that yes, World War II may have been a major wake-up call that led to a number of conventions on genocide, actions against the German genocide, and all those kinds of things. But all these actions, despite the laws that we have had implemented since 1949 and since the Nuremberg Tribunal, we keep seeing the repetition of these activities. For example, following the pogrom of 1955, what did John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State in the US, tell us? He called on Greece and Turkey to mend their fences and think of the broader strategic interests rather than talk about what took place in Istanbul the nights of September 5 and 6. Look beyond. It's not a new idea. During World War I, we had plenty of evidence of what was happening to the Greek, the Armenian, the Assyrian minorities. Expulsions, killings, and all the things that we know took place in the 1920s. Was anything done about it? No. We have the correspondence and the reports of Admiral Bristol, the American High Commissioner in Constantinople during World War I, who advised Washington not to trouble the waters because, after all, America had business interests in Turkey, tobacco companies and other business interests in the area. So there is a history here. We adopt laws, we make major commitments that these criminal activities will never happen again, and yet they do happen again because other broader considerations manifest themselves and unfortunately dominate our thinking. I hope what this discussion has done is to wake up a lot of people, because times are critical, and I think we ought to think very seriously as to what has happened and is happening right now, because Turkish policies are systematic. Anyone who has been to Cyprus, as I have, since 1976, has seen the ethnic cleansing, the destruction of cultural heritage, all the things that we talked about today as part of the heritage of Turkish policy in the area. Thank you very much for being with us today, and we'll continue this discussion.